Hello and welcome to Ditching Hourly. I'm Jonathan Stark. Today I am joined by guest Michael Lynch. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Michael is the founder of Tiny Pilot and published a blog post, I guess it was last week, that's when it came across my radar, called I Regret My $46,000 Website Redesign or something to that effect, which probably a dozen people sent to me. I guess it was at the top of Hacker News. It was everywhere. It was everywhere. So congrats on the viral blog post.
Oh, thanks.
So before we get into the guts of the post, could you tell folks a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a software developer, so I spent most of my career at the big companies like Microsoft and Google, and I quit my job at Google in 2018 to start my own business. And so I tried a few different things over the years, and in 2020, the business that really gained traction was a business called Tiny Pilot, and it's a device I sell that lets people manage their computers remotely.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Just like a physical object?
Yeah. It's about a little bigger than like two decks of playing cards. You
Cool.
just plug it in.
All right, great. And so the blog post was about the website for Tiny Pilot, correct?
Right.
All right. So could you maybe give us a little bit of an overview for the two people who didn't read the article yet? Could you give kind of an overview of that whole situation?
Sure. So I had been making little changes to the website. I created the website myself when I first launched in 2020, and it didn't look very good. I'm not a great designer. I just found a free Bootstrap theme online and threw that up because at the time I hadn't had any sales yet, and I told myself that if the company made it, I would hire a professional designer to make a real design. And then about a year later, the company was making about $45,000 per month in sales, and so I felt like it was time to actually hire that designer. And so I interviewed a few different designers, and the one I ended up going with was an agency. They were the most expensive that I interviewed per hour. They charged $175 an hour, but they thought it would probably take 20 to 40 hours, like a $7,000 job over the course of a few weeks. And then the project ended up spiraling kind of out of control. And as you might guess from the title, $46,000, it was way more than 7,000.
So I have a bunch of questions already.
Sure.
The first one is just sort of general from a business standpoint. I'm curious, is the $45,000 a month that you were bringing in at the time, is that recurring revenue or that's just straight up sales?
That's just straight sales.
Okay.
Yeah, there's currently not really recurring revenue for Tiny Pilot, or there's like a very small amount from people who have custom licenses.
Okay. So then but you were reasonably comfortable that that was going to be a stable number. So putting some
Yeah,
money into the website.
it had been in that area for a few months, and it was trending gently upwards, but generally it was increasing.
Okay. So you're like, all right, I've got some money to play with here to get the site done for real.
Right.
And you said that you looked at a bunch of different. Where did you look? I'm curious where you looked for people to help you with this. Did you check Fiverr or ask around, or how did you come up with the list of people that you maybe spoke with or whatever or investigated?
Yeah, I looked a little bit at Upwork, and I've used Upwork a lot in the past, but I pretty much stopped using it a couple years ago. I feel like Upwork is fine for certain jobs, but in my experience, quality tops out at a certain level. Like once people get to a certain level of success on Upwork, they tend to leave Upwork. And I had some friends that are also indie founders, and so I asked them for recommendations. And I looked at a few of those and interviewed some of those people, but they didn't have their portfolios had a style that was pretty different than what I was looking for. And then I looked at the Hacker News monthly hiring threads. So people advertise if they're a freelancer or agency in those threads. And so I looked at some of those websites, and the agency that I ended up hiring is one that I found through those threads because I thought their website looked pretty good. And then in the interviews with them, they were pretty impressive.
Okay. And I know you said that when you started, you just sort of threw up your own website and you didn't think it was that great. And when you started
Yeah.
making real money, you'd redo the website. But what were you looking for? Like the flip side you could imagine someone thinking, well, I guess it's good enough, right? If you're doing
Right.
45K a month in reoccurring revenue,
Right.
why bother? What was the design? Did you feel like it was holding you back, or were you just embarrassed by it? What were the motivations to at the point where you did pull the trigger? What was the motivation?
Yeah, I wanted to appeal to more business customers. When I started out, it appealed to a lot of home users who wanted a low cost alternative to some of the enterprise solutions for this. And I think there's a large potential customer base of not enterprise customers, but like small to medium sized businesses who don't really need the complexity of the enterprise competitors in this space and would be interested in something like mine. But I suspected that they would be turned off by a website that looked more like a project than a business.
Hmm.
And I've heard a lot of feedback since the blog post where people are like, oh, well, IT people don't care. Like they just want to know that it works.
Hmm.
And I think that's true to a degree, but I think there are other stakeholders in the real decision making process. Like the IT people usually have to send it to somebody else in their company to get approval to spend $300 on something. So if they're showing them something like, hey, this looks like a real business, that's a much easier sell than like, wait a second, this looks like something a guy put up over the weekend. Like, is this a real company?
Right? Are we going to get hacked?
Right.
Okay, so it seems like a reasonable. It feels like a pretty standard. Like, oh, I want it to look more trustworthy. I want it to look
Yeah.
more professional.
Right.
Did you think that the website? Did you expect when doing the before you decided to redo the website? Did you expect that it would have a noticeable increase in sales? Like, were you that sure that it would make a difference, or were you just kind of like, maybe it will?
Yeah, I mean it's one of those things I was just going by gut feel. Like I know there are ways of A/B testing it to be really sure, but it's hard to do at my scale. Like I have maybe like 3 to 5 sales a day generally, and so like measuring conversion rate on those would take a while. And
Right.
so I felt like I had also had some experience. One of the developers working with me did like working on design, so he had improved the design quite a bit since my original first draft, and that did correlate with increases in sales. I mean, it's hard to pin it because there were also lots of other things going on around the same time, but it seemed to be like as we improve the website, the conversion rates seem to improve, and so I expected that if we invested more in that, we could expect to see a bit more.
Okay. All right. Great. So I think that's a pretty good roundup of the motivations. Now, why did you pick the most expensive one? And when you say most expensive, you mean by the hour, right? Like
Right,
the highest
right,
hourly rate.
right.
Was it dramatically more than others, or were they kind of like, the second one was maybe 150 and you're like, they're kind of more or less the same price wise. It seems like, air quotes price wise, because an hourly rate's not a price,
Right.
but what flipped the bit for you in terms of going with the highest hourly rate? Was it just the interview you had with the person there?
It was it was a combination of the portfolio matched the style I had in mind, and they had a pretty deep bench in terms of talent available. So they had illustrators, they had people that could do 3D imaging, they had people that could do animation if we wanted. I didn't really need developers, but I liked that they had developers because it suggested to me that the designers were used to working with people that like actually had to implement this stuff. It wasn't just like they could throw together a design. It would have to be a design that takes into account the realities of CSS and HTML.
Got it. Okay. And just out of curiosity, is it like a WordPress website? Is it built on something standard, or did you do it yourself? Or
It's built on a technology called Gridsome.
Hmm.
So it's a static site generator. I really like static site generators, and I stumbled upon Gridsome like 2 years ago, and it's sort of like the Vue.js equivalent of Gatsby. So Gatsby's for
Okay.
React.
Yeah. 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 All right.
And I was like, wow, this is a great thing. And I was really excited to migrate my stuff over to it. And so that was the natural thing to use when I wanted to launch a quick website because I didn't want to learn a whole new thing. And then like 2 months after I switched over to it, the maintainers abandoned the project. So now I'm stuck
Yikes.
with on this tech stack but it's not too bad. It's still just Vue. So if you know Vue, you can work with the stack.
Okay, so yeah, pretty good reason to think like, maybe it's good that they work with developers.
Yeah,
It's not like you're doing a WordPress theme.
right, right.
Okay, so you pulled the trigger, right?
Yep.
Did they give you anything in writing? Was it like, or is it just like kind of a over email? You're like, okay, this sounds good. Send me your invoice when it comes. Was there a deposit? Anything like that?
Yeah, so there was a contract that said I'm just paying them by the hour. I mean, it was kind of boilerplate, like agency or freelancer agreement. It wasn't a statement of work. It was just like they're going to do the the things that I asked them to do. And then, yeah, they required a payment upfront of each 30-hour block. So I'd buy 30 hours at a time, and then they would do the work. And then when they ran out of hours, they would ask me to pay for another block.
Cool. And were there regular weekly meetings or anything like that, or was it just kind of they let you know when they had an update or something to review?
They wanted weekly meetings. I think that's what a lot of their clients are used to. I'm pretty anti-meeting, especially like a recurring meeting where there's no specific agenda ahead of time. So I pushed for like we'll meet and like we'll go over the updates, but I don't want us to just be like meeting for you to tell me whatever you did that week.
Hmm. Okay. Okay, so they started, and as we know from the blog post, things started to go wrong. What was the
Right.
first warning sign?
Well, at first it went really well. Like we were making good progress. They started making a logo that I really liked. But the first red flag was they started to go beyond the scope. So when we initially talked, they said, "Hey, like you actually shouldn't do a redesign. You should just do a rebrand. You should focus on the logo, the colors, the fonts." And that was a thing that won my confidence because I was like, "Wow, they're scoping down the project. Like I was willing to give them more money, and they're suggesting something that is better for me." But then as we got into it, they started doing things that were beyond what I thought of as a rebranding. They started showing me different versions of the website with different icons and things that I think went a little bit beyond just a rebranding. But it was a little hard for me to tell because like this was my first time working with a design agency. And so the the distinction, the boundary between what's a redesign and what's a rebrand, because they were when I would ask, they're like, well, some brands don't work on your old design, so we're gonna tweak the design a little bit to fit the brand, but we're still doing just a redesign or just a rebrand rather.
Mm, okay, that does sound murky. So yeah, so I don't want to tell the story. So what because I know what happens next. But so what did happen next? So you must have gotten some sort of notification like, okay, your 30 hours are gone.
Yeah, so they went through the first 30 hours, and at that point it felt pretty fine because they were nearing the end of the logo. Felt like they were making pretty good progress, and then they started the next batch, and then that ended up going a lot slower. So they stopped responding to my questions. They stopped responding to my notes, and things just got really slow. But at the time it was December, so I was like, it's the holidays, maybe people are just out and they'll pick up again in January. But then in January things got worse, and I remember there was one instance where I said something like, "Oh, can we increase the contrast in the background of this dialog box?" And it took like three back and forth before they understood what that meant, and I was like, I felt like that's a pretty straightforward request. And so it was such a it was such a difference from the earlier discussion where it felt like we were very much in sync, and they were almost reading my mind with the logo, where they were going in the direction that I wanted. And then it was suddenly like they felt very distracted and were not as engaged as before.
Now, were you dealing with the same person, like at one contact person, or did they keep changing, or you'd work maybe directly? Sometimes you'd communicate directly with a designer, not an account manager, or how did that go?
It was mainly the same person. It was mainly their lead designer. Sometimes it was the project manager, and then the project manager disappeared. I later found out that he quit in November, and so that was part of the reason that things went off the rails. But
Mm,
usually it was the lead designer.
okay. All right. So then January, they're not reading my mind anymore.
Yeah,
But still sending invoices, presumably. I mean, did
right,
they didn't do anything in December, it sounded like, really. And
right.
then January they come back and they're like, contrast, what's that?
Uh,
And um what like financially, how much have you burned through at this point to have nothing done, not one thing done?
At that point, it was probably around 20K.
Hmm. Okay. And what happened next?
Then I finally reached out to their CEO and was like, what's going on? The quality is very different than how we started. And like it seemed like there was only 10 or 20 hours left in the project. Like we were almost done with the logo. We had picked new fonts. So that part actually was done. They had delivered me the name of a new font and I was able to purchase that. But just in terms of like finalizing the design that was going to fit with the new logo and color scheme and everything, it was just like everything was like 80% done. And so I talked to the CEO and he was like, yeah, like we've had some troubles because the project manager quit. I've been trying to fill in, and we've got like a lot of new work from our bigger clients that are on retainer agreements with us. And so like we've been trying to fit you into the cracks, but that's probably why you're noticing that like the communication isn't as smooth as before. And so I was pretty upset at that point. Like,
Yeah.
you just left me with like a half finished thing, or not even a half. It was like 80 to 90% most of the stuff was done, but it was just like I didn't have anything that I could really use.
And he's telling you when you've called to complain, not in advance, when he could have told you in November that the project manager quit and he's
Right.
scrambling. It's like,
Right.
really,
Exactly.
that's real weak.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you've got at this point 20 grand into it. It feels like stuff's only 20 hours from being done, so you're
Yeah.
you're carrying a huge sunk cost. Like,
Yeah.
so I can imagine the you said yourself you were upset at that point. Did you
Yeah.
consider firing them, or was it just so close? It was like so close. You're like, oh, if we could just get across the finish line, I'll just never talk to these people again.
Yeah, I considered firing them. The problem was I was also in the middle of launching a new product. And so I wanted to do a marketing push when I had the new product ready. So like I knew from the experience of trying to find a freelancer or agency, it wasn't easy. I'd probably spent 30 hours on the process of interviewing and then just like bringing the company up to speed. And I really didn't like the idea of having to do that again. And it was a tough call. Like I didn't I felt like I was being taken advantage of, but at the end of the day, like I wanted the website done. And the thing that seemed like it was going to get it done the fastest was just letting this agency finish out the last 10 or 20 hours. Cause I felt like if I brought in somebody else to finish out the work, it was just going to be so much work of like finding them, trying to bridge the gap between the old and the new. And then I, with this agency, at least they were a known quantity. Like I knew what I was getting. Whereas if I brought somebody else, they could be even worse, and I'd have to fire them. And then maybe it's a year later before I finally get somebody that can do this work. And so I felt like, I'm close enough. Like the thing I want is just to wrap it up, and then I can put this whole thing behind me.
Right. And so I want to call out the mental calculus going on here for someone in your situation, because frankly, a lot of people wrote in about the situation, and I was like, oh, this is a good example of something that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like your nuances were very specific. The retainer thing is very interesting wrinkle,
Mm-hmm.
but it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And people like you end up in this situation where it just, where they're unhappy, upset, spent at this point 3 times more than the estimate.
Yeah.
But the cost of switching feels higher than the cost of staying and just
Right.
sticking it out.
Right.
But I mean, you've got a software background, and we all know the joke. How's the project going? Oh, 90% done, 90% to go.
Uh,
So how, did it end up from that point moving forward? Did it end up that it really was 10 or 20 hours, or what happened?
It really was. So my initial plan was to have them do the design and then have my in-house developers do the development work. And so it really was like that was correct. There was a very small amount of design work left at that point. But the problem was I couldn't get them to do the design work because they were like, well, we really don't have any time for hourly clients right now. And so like if you want us to do this and you want us to have the same focus that we had in the beginning of the project, you need to either like wait indefinitely. And I was asking like, well, is it going to be done within the next 2 months? And he's like, I really can't say. But like the thing that can guarantee,
the owner?
yeah, this is the CEO. But he was like, but one way you can do it is if you sign a retainer agreement with us. So that way, like you'll have guaranteed hours with us, and then we can finish the remaining work for sure. Like you don't have to worry about being preempted because we'll have guaranteed time.
This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So what he's saying is we haven't got time to work on this, but if you pay us more money, we have time to work on this.
Right. And that's something I brought up with him is like, well, you're saying you don't have time. So like, why would you have time if I had a retainer? And he's like, well, the thing that we're going to do, if you sign a retainer, we're going to reorganize our staff so that like we have permanent people working on your project. Like we want to, like, I actually found his explanation reasonable. They're like, we want to build long-term partnerships. And so like, we want to dedicate consistent workers to the people that have retainer agreements with us. And so like, if you're just on an hourly, it's hard for us to tell a retainer client, like, no, the lead designer isn't available because they're working for an hourly client. But if you're a retainer client, then like, it's much easier for us to justify the cost of like, okay, we're giving you 10 hours of our lead designer's time per month and like denying those 10 hours to other clients, which like not great for me as a client, but like at the same time, I do get that they want to reward people that make long-term commitments to them. Like if it were my position, if the roles were reversed, I hope I wouldn't put somebody in a position where like the project is half done and the only option is to do a retainer. But I did get the idea of like, it made a little bit of sense to me.
Well, and it makes sense to me too, but here's the problem. It happened 4 or 5 months in, and it's,
right.
That should have been the discussion in day one.
Right.
If this was going to happen, then it should have been a conversation today. This is my opinion. He should have said, no, we're not taking you on hourly because you're going to get a crappy experience.
Right.
Or said, we'll take you on as an hourly client, but it could take a year. We're just going to, you're just going to get in dribs and drabs of time. There might months might go by, which they did, where you get nothing done.
Right.
So, you didn't really have all the information to make an informed decision at the point where you had to make the decision before you had this massive amount of sunk cost.
Right.
So, and okay, maybe he thought things would be better than they turned out. That's probably what happened.
Yeah, that was my sense.
Yeah, but for him to not make it right when he's supposedly the expert and he made a promise that he couldn't keep.
Right.
That's real. That's the kind of thing. So now, like, dear listener, imagine being the client and being on the receiving end of this kind of a situation. I'm telling you, it happens all the time. Like, ask anybody that hires people by the hour, especially design stuff, especially web stuff. Or maybe that's not fair. I just talked to a lot of people like that, so that's probably just confirmation bias. But
yeah,
but it happens all the time. This is
sure.
one of the things I hate about hourly. I used to run an agency. I was the VP of an agency, and this happened all the time. Like every project. It wasn't a surprise when it happened.
Right.
Like, how come these clients are telling us to do all these different things, So like the scope is creeping everywhere because the client keeps changing their mind. So fingers are pointing in both directions. That's not what happened with you.
Right.
But this kind of thing happens all the time.
Right.
And then to blame the client for being too small when that was totally on the table at the beginning of the deal.
Right.
And things go sideways and the owner of the firm is like, no, I'm not going to make this right. You need to become like one of our big clients and then magically we'll get this 10 or 20 hours across the finish line. It's just really,
it was definitely frustrating.
And kudos to you for not dragging them online. Anyway. Okay. So how did it feels like we're nearing the conclusion of the tale. So what happened next?
So yeah, they wrapped up once we started the retainer. The design work went really smoothly. It was really like going back to the beginning of the project where everything was smooth. The dev work was a lot bumpier. I think they weren't really used to working for another developer. Like when I have freelance developers that work in-house in a Tiny Pilot, and like we all do code reviews. I typically review when somebody's first starting, I review all their code before it goes in, and then they move on to just doing peer reviews among the other developers. But I was reviewing their code. I think they didn't have experience with that. I think they also underestimated like what they wanted to do, they ended up wanting to completely throw away the theme that we had and redesign a theme from scratch to implement the new designs, and that took a lot longer than they expected. So
Bless.
I was expecting the work to be done that month. I figured like I was buying 60 hours for March, and I figured like, okay, 10 to 20 hours to wrap up the design, and then maybe like 10 to 15 hours to implement those designs on each page. Because I only needed redesigns on 3 pages. But then it ended up being they, through some miscommunication, they ended up fixing bugs instead of like minor bugs on the site instead of starting the design work. Then the whole theme thing took another 5 weeks. And then it wasn't until, and then by that point, they were dragging for so long and I was so deep in that I was just like, okay, like I have to terminate the project. So fortunately the retainer only had a 28-day notice period. So if it had been a longer commitment, I wouldn't have done it. But 1 month wasn't too bad. And so I told them like, hey, it's over. This isn't going the way I wanted. And then it was sort of surprising that that's the point where like the project went really smoothly. After that, they did finish each page in about a week each. And then at the end of the month, the project was done.
Hmm. So here's another reason why I think the owner's logical but unpersuasive story about you needing to be on retainer is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
He knew you weren't going to be a long-term client. So,
Well, it was possible that we could be. Like he also wanted to redesign. So there's like the website, and then there's the web app in the product itself. And from the beginning, he was like, we could redesign the web app for you. Like we're really interested in doing that, which I was open to. And like it could have been like that was the other thing keeping me going, that like this did have the potential to be a good relationship. Like within the team, there's no UX experts. One of the developers on the team is pretty good at design, but whenever we do have to do something that's very UX heavy, it takes us much longer than I think a professional UX designer would take. And so just having like a designer on retainer for 40 hours that we could like offload some front end work to, offload some design work to when we needed to, like that had a lot of potential. And so he wanted that to continue. Like he wanted us to be a long-term client. He also wanted, like, I think he was also hoping for us to grow to the point where like maybe we are doing like $20,000 to $30,000 with design work. Like if the website really takes off, the changes make a big difference, then we become a big client for him.
okay, that makes sense then. Okay, so there was some hope.
Yeah.
Okay, but ultimately you did pull the plug. They
Right.
finished the work. I don't think was there anything else there? The site went live, right?
Yep.
And then what happened? The month after, the first 30 days after the new site went live.
So it did seem to increase sales. So the first month, I think it was like a 30% increase in sales. And then the next month, it was something like I think a 20 or 25% from the previous month. So I think in month 2, it was like 60% higher than the month before we launched the new designs. And again, this is not rigorous, so I don't know how much of that is due to the new design, but it was like a record high in sales, and there was no other. Usually, like when we have a big record sales, there's some event that explains it, and like really nothing else had happened. So it did seem like it was contributing to sales. I did invite the CEO to do a postmortem. I told him I wanted to write a blog post about the experience and say, like the things that I learned, and I told him like I thought there were a lot of things that both of us could have done to improve the outcome. And so we had that conversation.
Mm, okay. And here's something I found interesting about the blog post and the people who sent it in, because I wrote sort of you inspired me to write a sort of highly summarized version of like the classic situation. So I used some of your numbers, for example, anonymously,
Right.
but so a lot of people wrote in, were like, "Oh, I saw that article too." Like they knew because it was like the same day yours came out or the same day I heard of it, and there's a lot of conversation about it, and a lot of people didn't get all the way to the conclusion where you said something I found really interesting, which was that like you just said, it seemed like it contributed to a significant increase in sales. Maybe 60% increase in sales for the first couple of months. And that, which almost I'm trying to remember the numbers. It didn't quite cover the 46,000 you spent, but it was pretty close to recouping your money in like 2 months.
Right.
But then and presumably that would continue at those levels. Who knows? Maybe not, but it could.
Hmm.
And you said if you were going that you regret it. I mean, the whole in the title it says you regretted it. It's like, well, but it
Right.
worked out great. So like, why? What's the thing you regret? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I regret how much time it took up. I think I probably could have gotten 80% of the benefit with 20% of the effort. I think it really should have been a much more tightly scoped project. I think that we didn't talk about this too much, but like it sort of kept growing in scope. Like they wanted to the boundary between the rebrand and the redesign was blurry, and then the line between like what's strictly necessary to implement this design and then what's necessary to maintain good coding practices like that continued like bloating the scope of the project. So I think it was I don't like to take huge bets, and like I don't want to just spend $45,000 and then just say like, oh, let's see if I make it back. Like I'd much rather make a much smaller bet, like, something like that's going to take 20 hours of my time and maybe $10,000, $15,000, and then see if that has an impact on sales,
Mm-hmm.
rather than this big bet that like really has to pay off a lot for it to be worth the time. But I think I probably could have gotten, there's an opportunity cost in all the other things that I was doing
Right, right.
when I was dealing with this agency for 8 months.
So if they had come to you, in day one when you were looking for agencies, and they said, "Oh, it'll take about 8 months, and it'll be $46,000,"
Yeah, definitely not.
right? So you kind of got, and you said in the post and here that you feel like both parties could have done things differently
Hmm.
to improve the experience, but you got kind of dragged through it. Like there's it's not, and I'm not pointing fingers at this mystery agency really.
Hmm.
I think the a huge contributor to the situation is hourly billing,
Hmm.
which I know we discussed somewhere. I think it was email
Hmm.
that you still think you disagreed. Basically, you were like,
Yeah.
well, I'm a fan of hourly billing,
Yeah.
and I'm here to tell you that hourly billing is the reason this happened.
Yeah. So I'm interested in your case for why hourly billing was at the root of it.
Well, because the incentives are misaligned.
Hmm.
It's financially beneficial for the seller to take longer and
Right.
bloat the scope, it,
Hmm.
and that's the opposite of what the buyer wants. The
Right.
buyer wants it done in 20 hours for $10,000,
Right.
and the problem is that it's insidious.
Hmm.
I used to bill by the hour. We weren't, immoral or trying to cheat anybody.
Right.
But the fact that we would be punished financially for being fast
Hmm.
causes you to not think of ways to be fast.
Right.
So you just don't come up with ways to be fast. And to your
Hmm.
point, when people are really good at estimating, when the seller is really good at estimating their hours and the seller is really good at controlling the scope
Hmm.
and is always trying to do less scope, not more,
Hmm.
you can create customer satisfaction. You can have a
Right.
situation where the the client is happy.
Hmm.
The estimate that was given up front ends up being the price and not
Hmm.
some other higher number being the price.
Hmm.
It's true that you can do that, but you're playing on hard mode as the seller.
Right.
If you're selling
Right.
hours, you have zero incentive to be able to do better work quicker. There's just none. I don't even understand why people buy faster computers. Why would you do that? Invest all that money to lose money.
Right.
So it's not that, I agree that yes, probably even in this exact same model, things could have been done differently. Maybe those weekly meetings would have been a good idea,
Hmm.
um, so that you could spot them scope creeping or get clarity between the rebrand and the redesign or whatever.
Hmm. Right.
But it is when I was running a firm, I had these problems with dozens, scores of clients. It was
Hmm.
extraordinarily common, and everyone's
Right.
just sort of like mystified, like how come this keeps happening? And no one,
Uh-huh.
like we're doing our best. We're really genuinely trying to do our best. We're trying to hit the estimates, but you're not penalized other than getting angry emails
Hmm.
and occasional tough conversations like your postmortem or like your conversation when he told you needed to buy a retainer. That was a normal occurrence.
Right.
it's a normal occurrence in this model.
Right.
And as soon as I realized that it was certainly a root cause, if not the sole cause, it was a major cause, I was like, oh, that would fix everything.
Hmm.
So what if someone had, so imagine if someone came to you, or if even this agency, it doesn't matter if it was this one or another one really.
Hmm.
What if they came to you and said, oh, um, what are you looking to do? Well, I feel like the site doesn't look professional. I'd like it to look professional. I think I'm pretty sure it'll contribute to an increase in sales. Maybe 10% would be nice. 10% increase in sales. I feel like that's reasonable. And they
Hmm.
said, okay, 10% increase in sales. That's, four or $5,000 a month. If you give us 15 grand, we'll get you that 10% increase in sales by redesigning the site.
Hmm.
Would that have been, and like, boom, just give them 15 grand. They go do their thing. They come back with the designs, and maybe you guys have to work together to implement them because it's an unusual website architecture. But, would that have been an attractive thing, or would you not have even been able to wrap your head around someone who didn't have an hourly rate?
No, I mean, like some of the people that I interviewed pitched an hour or pitched like a milestone based plan.
With prices for each milestone, or?
Right, with prices for
Okay.
each milestone. So I don't have anything against milestone based pricing. The biggest problem was just that the agency wasn't willing to do that. Like to them, I'm a small client. Like for them to commit to milestone based pricing, they have to kind of make predictions about me and like especially for something where it's like very open ended, like create a new logo, create a new brand. If I'm just unsatisfied for weeks at a time, then like it's a terrible deal for them because they're stuck in this thing that's like $15,000 is a pretty small amount to them, and they're stuck on this unbounded contract. So like for this, I would have liked if they had said like we'll do like a package deal where it's a flat fee. That would have been nice, but it also if I had insisted on that, I wouldn't have gotten the agency that I wanted.
Right. I mean, you're extraordinarily sort of empathetic with their situation in
Mm-hmm.
this particular agency.
Right.
But for the listener, the comment that you just made about the unbounded scope, it's like how do they know that they could satisfy me? It's like, well, if they're good at it, if they had a financial incentive to get good at picking clients that they could satisfy with their logo package,
Mm-hmm.
then they'd probably, if they had that financial incentive, then they probably would get better at it. But since they don't have that financial incentive, they don't get better at it.
I don't think it's like me being especially empathetic. It's from working with a lot of freelancers. Like I've worked with graphic designers before, and I've interviewed a lot of them about like I wrote a blog post about hiring a graphic designer, and so I interviewed a lot of them. And one of the things that surprised me was how reluctant a lot of them are to start working with a new client, especially on a platform like Upwork, where it's biased in the favor of the client because the client does have a lot of power. Like once you sign the contract with them, they will try to expand the scope and make you do more than you agreed to. And so, like, I'm not trying to protect them from me, but I think if you as the client, if you're limiting it to agencies that only do flat fee billing for a project like this, then you're eliminating the agencies that are good, but that are afraid of a terrible client that's going to ask for the moon for like a $15,000 flat fee.
Yeah, that's true. I don't see the downside of that, but yes, it's true. Like it will limit it will limit your choices to the people
Right.
who will give you a price instead of giving you an estimate and then turning out later the price was what, five times more?
Right. But I think for a business of my size, you don't generally have that luxury. Like I didn't have that luxury. It's not like I had 20 agencies to choose from and I went with the one that had hourly. Like I found
Right.
one agency that I thought was a good match, and they because they have the luxury of being choosy about their clients, like they want to protect themselves with an hourly contract. So I can't both have the agency that I want or that seems talented enough to do what I want and have a flat fee.
Hmm. Okay, but if there was one though, would that have been
Sure.
preferable?
Yes.
All right, that's the important piece. So I grant you that most people who do stuff like this bill by the hour for the exact reason that you just said, which is that they're protecting themselves. They're not protecting you.
Right.
They're protecting themselves from you.
Sure.
So it sets up this dynamic where it's from the jump. It's people sitting on opposite sides of the table. Like a lot of agencies will talk a big game, especially dev shops. They'll talk a big game. We're your partner,
Hmm.
trusted advisor, all that stuff. But we
Hmm.
don't trust you. We don't trust you
Right.
to not abuse our time.
Right.
So we're going to bill by the hour. It's like, well, are you a partner or not?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's hard. Like, if with a flat fee, the client doesn't quite have skin in the game, like it costs them nothing to keep asking to see more revisions, to see different versions of ideas. So there's perverse incentives with that as well.
So here's my this is old news to people who've listened to the podcast or my mailing list, but revisions are not what you want as a client.
Mhm.
What you
Mhm.
want is the outcome. So
Right.
if I don't know, IDEO comes along and is like, hey, we've got a package for $15,000. We'll do a complete rebrand, give you everything you need. Ensure that it's something that can be implemented into your site architecture. Your guys do the implementation, but we'll give you just a design, not a gorgeous design, but a design that gives you the outcome that you want.
Right.
So imagine how attractive it would be for an agency who is promising you like an increase in sales.
Mhm.
Would you really be worried about revisions if they were able to do that?
I'm skeptical that an agency can guarantee any particular uh, increase in sales. Like, I think, like 10% is maybe modest, but like if they're going for more than that, like I think it's hard for them to guarantee. And then I don't really love the idea of like I have to blindly take whatever they give me because the outcome is the only thing I care about. Like
Go into that more.
the outcome is a thing that I care about, but I still want it to feel like my site. Like if they said, okay, like to get to 10%, we're going to have like a big thing that flashes and like lots of animation and stuff, and it makes it feel like a totally different company. Like I don't want that. I still want to be able to have some creative contribution into like what makes the site feel like authentically my site and still my brand.
Sure. Yeah. And a good agency will do that too. I mean, that would be, no agency is going to come along and be like, oh, we're going to completely change your brand to increase sales.
Right.
Probably.
Right.
So yeah, that's totally fair. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
I would just, I guess that's a tacit assumption, but it's good that you made it explicit. Right. So if someone came along was like, I mean, I've literally, when I was doing development, I had one client toward the end where, I knew it was sort of an introduction through a friend. It was kind of like it was a referral, and I
Mm-hmm.
kind of felt like I was doing him a favor.
Mm-hmm.
Probably shouldn't have taken the client on. I
Uh,
knew it wasn't a great personality fit, but I knew I could do. I knew I could do what he wanted, which
right.
was make his desktop site work great on mobile and he really wanted that because he could see that his in his analytics that the mobile traffic was going through the roof,
Mm-hmm.
and the site was literally unusable on a phone.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave him a couple of options, or three options to choose from, and one of the lower options was that I would inherit the styling, colors, fonts, and all that stuff from the main site, but there would be no design review.
Mm-hmm.
He was not allowed to, he could give me feedback about stuff, but I was not going to be. If I thought it was a good idea, I might do it, but I might not.
Mm-hmm.
The goal was to decrease abandoned carts on mobile,
Mm-hmm.
and we weren't, it was just gonna be a waste of everybody's time for him to be like, oh, could you make that red a little redder?
Right.
So, and that was the one he picked.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we did, and it
Mm-hmm.
was like, and it was kind of like and I didn't do, it was the kind of site that you could have flashing animations and be real gross, and real
Mm-hmm.
salesy because it was like a low ticket, lots of low ticket sales.
Right.
But yeah, no, so there's a little bit of assurance there that it wasn't going to look like a different site. Like it needed to
Sure.
still match the desktop version.
Sure.
Yeah, and I gave him a fixed price for that, and it was fine. It was not the greatest, but it was fine.
Was yours, was it the price just for the design or was it the implementation as well?
Implementation as well.
I think that's a little bit of a factor here as well, because it is possible for the designers, like if it's a fixed price, it's possible for the designers to introduce complicated designs that are like look nice, but are not actually easy to implement.
Hmm.
That shifts work onto the developers. So that was a bit of a factor too. Like I wanted to make sure I was still protecting the dev side and not letting, like if they just say like, okay, we guarantee you if you implement these designs, you'll see a 10% increase, but then they'd like give me a design where desktop looks one way and mobile looks completely different, it's like very hard to make a responsive design that does both, then it's
How does the hourly help with that though?
um with the agency doing the dev work.
How does hourly help with the situation where the designers come up with a design that's hard to implement?
Oh, because I still have feedback into the design work. Like it sounds like you're talking about a situation where you say like, I'm going to guarantee you this outcome. You don't give me feedback, or like I don't necessarily have to take your feedback, but like I'm going to guarantee you an outcome. I think that would have been a problem here if they say like, I'm going to guarantee you a 10% increase in sales, but and so you don't get to like give feedback into our process, but the end result is designs that I have to hand over to my developers, and then my developers have to do the work of putting it up on the site.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay. Yeah, that is, it is, you have there are a bunch of, there's probably three or four interesting nuances in your particular version of this story. One being that you're on a deprecated platform in the first place, which is like, like if it was WordPress or Shopify or something, then an agency really would be able to come along and say, yeah, like they could just look at your site and be like, the call to actions are all wrong. We can fix this in like 2 days.
The platform I don't think was too big of an issue. Like it's basically just a Vue site, so like it was Vue and Bootstrap, which are pretty commonplace.
So then why not have them implement it?
Just because like I felt like I'm good at managing a dev team already. Like I didn't need to pay a much higher rate to get their devs as opposed to mine. But I'm curious about the like if the roles were reversed and you're like soliciting bids on this project, and you feel very strongly that hourly is the cause of many problems in projects.
Hmm.
Like what do you do in my shoes if the agency that you want is only willing to do hourly, and you're too small a client to have a lot of influence over them to change the pay structure? Like what are your options at that point?
Well, I mean, if there's no option, there's no option. But I would not enter into a relationship where the power dynamic put me in such a weak position.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah,
care
I
how good
agree
their
with that.
stuff is. I mean,
Right,
I'm not gonna. I don't want to be the small fish. I want to be the big
right,
fish.
right. Yeah, I agree with that.
Does that make my search much harder? Yeah, probably.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like I'm in a sort of a weird position, like a company my size, like any agency that I can find, if I like Google search or something, is generally going to be too big for me. And then the agencies that proactively reach out are like very low quality overseas, like we'll do it for $500 or something, like
Hmm.
very unreasonable.
Well, that reminds me, you had some interesting like follow up in at the end of the article, where it's like a whole bunch of people were like, "Why didn't you just like
Right,
do this, do that, do the other?" So like, what were some of the things that like why didn't you just move the whole thing to Shopify? Why didn't you
right,
just? What were some of the other ones? Why didn't you just get 10 of these? Oh, we'll do it for $500 people
right.
and throw away 9 of them.
Yeah. I'm just so skeptical that they like do it for $500 people can produce anything good. I don't know if you're a fan of Joel Spolsky, but
Hmm.
he wrote this article that has always stuck with me, called Hitting the High Notes, where like if you he was talking at the time, he was talking about like Zune versus iPod. And he was like, iPod is just like so clearly a better design than the Zune. And like even if you gave Microsoft like 50 years to design a better Zune, like they would never get to the iPod just because they can't hit the high notes. And I feel like that's true with design and development. Like if I hire like 10 low rate designers and developers, like I'm probably not going to get any good results, and I'm going to burn a lot of time in working with them. And so I do like I feel like you do have to find, like that's the thing that's hard, is like the people that claim that they can do good work and the people that can't but are expensive are hard to distinguish between until you start actually working with them.
Mm.
Some people have like fake portfolios or whatever, and so you have to kind of like invest time into working with them. Like if you're Google or somebody who can throw around like $100,000 and not care, like you can work with like bigger players who have a better track record. But like at my scale, you're working with people who you can't really like get a lot of information about them before you start working with them. And so you do have to make a bit of an investment. And so for something like where they're saying like it's a pretty small project, it's hard to get like 10 or 20 hours in and then say like, actually, no, like you're not ideal. I'm going to start over with somebody better. Or,
Hmm.
and then like going back to your question of like, why not 10 of the low quality? Like, I think I've never had a good experience. Like I've tried hiring like low cost developers and it's just like, I just always get garbage. And so it's not really worth it to me.
Hmm. All right. I mean, so you're basically, it's kind of like buying the entry level BMW. That's kind of what you did,
Uh,
right? So you're like, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna. I could buy two Kias or three
right.
Kias, right? But I want to be. I want this website to be like a luxury purchase. This redesign
Sure.
wants to be
Right.
a luxury purchase, but I can't afford the top of the line,
Right.
or don't want to. I mean, it sounds like you could because you did. You did go for the retainer eventually.
Right.
But it was like, yeah, really didn't want to do that. I would have never done that up front, right?
Right.
So they kind of like, it was kind of like the used car salesman or the car salesman being like, oh, do you want the undercoat? Do you want the, heated seats? And like all of a sudden you're into, you
right.
know, five times more than you were expecting to spend.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's a reasonable place for a buyer to be coming from.
Yeah.
And do you feel like they did hit the high notes?
Um, I like the logo. I feel like they did a pretty good job with the logo. The design, yeah, like I don't think the design is amazing. Like I think a lot of the feedback I got from the article was like, oh, it looks like, like the average bootstrap site. And I think there's validity to that. But like it's definitely better than what I could have made. It's better than the portfolios I saw of the other people I interviewed. So I wouldn't say like they really hit it out of the park, but I think like if this was like a $15,000 job or a $20,000 job, I'd be very happy.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think it looks good, and the sales, if the sales can be attributed to the redesign, which it seems like it
Yeah.
can be, it was
Yeah.
worth every penny.
Sure.
So yeah, it's kind of like the experience of taking a train, taking the Acela from Providence to Boston,
Uh,
and whatever it costs, $150 or whatever it is, and you go to sit in like the quiet car, and they're like, oh no, you're going to be strapped to the front of the train, and you still get to Boston. What's the big deal? You
right.
know, it's like you get the experience of the journey was awful.
Right.
Yeah. So, and you got backed into a price for predictable reasons that you wouldn't have agreed to up front.
Right.
Yeah. That's how they get you, these hourly billers.
Uh,
They lowball you, and then you have sunk cost, and now it seems like the easiest thing to do is keep going.
right.
Um, so, all right. Well, I mean, if I was going to give you any advice, because you did ask, like, if I were in your shoes, what would I do?
Hmm.
Because you're right, it is tough to tell people who are talking a good game from the people who are actually good.
Hmm.
So, I would only work with someone. If I was planning on investing a significant amount of money, I would only work with someone on a real small sort of test drive basis first, which
Hmm.
which sounds like wouldn't have been an option with the people you wanted.
Hmm.
And same thing. You're not allowed to test drive a Ferrari.
Uh,
You either want it or you don't. Get out of here.
right.
But if it were me, that's what I would do. I would
Hmm.
find maybe two or three designers, maybe
Hmm.
three or four, and say, okay, I want to. Here's $500 or $1,000 or whatever it is, and I want
Hmm.
you to pick one thing.
Hmm.
Suggest a new color scheme, typography for my site. Just tell
Right.
me how I should redo the type. I'll do it.
Hmm.
You just tell me how.
Sure.
Something like that, and see what the
Yeah.
working relationship is like. See if they're responsive. See if they do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. See if they keep their promises. Is basically what it boils down to. It's
Yeah.
like have them make a promise and keep it. Make a promise,
Sure.
keep it. Make a promise
Yeah.
and keep it. That's how you build like a trusting any kind of trusting relationship. But that's a trusting
Yeah.
business relationship. And maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I feel like a really good designer, pretty good designer who understands you inside out
Hmm.
is going to do a better job than like a prima donna designer who comes in as like, you didn't get any revisions. We're just going to like make it the most beautiful piece of, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's like this, I feel it's sort of similar with employees. It's like, I'd rather hire somebody who can get on base every time, not someone who's always swinging for the fence.
Yeah.
But, maybe that's just me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that would have been a reasonable strategy. I think the thing that was limiting is I didn't have a large source of designers to ask. So like
Mm,
I guess I could have done Upwork, but I kind of reluctant to use it. But
mm,
like of the designers I found, like only interviewed probably like 4 or 5. And I felt like I could tell from the jump that a few of them wouldn't be a good match. But I've done bake-offs before. Actually, the illustrator that does all illustrations for my blog, I found her through a bake-off on Upwork where I just hired like several different designers to make one illustration.
mm.
And then I liked hers, and she's been working with me for 5 years. So that I
Very
definitely
good.
think that strategy can work.
Have you had a lot of people reach out since the article to say, "Oh, if you ever need somebody to," yeah.
Yeah, I got a lot of, but it's like those, it's it's all kind of meaningless because they're like, oh, I could have done it for like 3,000, and like, okay, but like, yeah, I'm still in the position of like I can't really verify those claims without like paying the money and like trying to get them to do a project. But at this point, I'm kind of burned out on touching the website, so I'm putting it on hold for a while.
Yeah, I'll bet. Well, hopefully this attention, is going to also increasing. See, now you're not going to be able to attribute it to the redesign. You
Right.
have to say, "Oh, I was at the top of Hacker News for 2 weeks," so
Right.
or whatever for an entire weekend.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, this has been super helpful to me. I hope the listeners got something out of it as well. And I wonder where can people go to find out more about you? Maybe check out your blog. Maybe they need to buy a Tiny Pilot for their server.
Sure. So my blog is mtlynch.io, and my website for Tiny Pilot is tinypilotkvm.com. That's Kilo Victor Mike.com. And I'm on Twitter at Deliberate Coder.
At Deliberate Coder. Cool.
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining me, Michael.
Thank you.
All right, folks. That's it for this week. I'm Jonathan Stark, and I hope you join me again next time for Ditching Hourly. Bye.